Thank you for checking out our YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe and like. And please visit us at barrykibrick.com, where you'll see all the ways that you can become a patron of our mission and help us continue to build a community of seekers who quest for knowledge, information, and most importantly, wisdom. What is it about music that can pierce our souls like nothing else? We'll find out when we meet the two-time Grammy-winning guitarist Laurence Juber. Welcome, I'm Barry Kibrick. Laurence came to the world's attention when he was the lead guitarist for Paul McCartney and Wings. But when he decided to go solo, his fusion of folk, jazz, and pop made him a legend, or as Pete Townsend of The Who said, a true master. We'll not only hear the master play live on our show today, but we'll dig deep to find out what makes the sound of music so vital to our lives.
Between the Lines with Barry Kibrick is made possible in part by Patreon. Patreon helps creators build and run membership businesses, from podcasters to writers, musicians, artists, and more, with tools that allow their fans to become patrons. More information is available at patreon.com. And Between the Lines with Barry Kibrick is also made possible by the following contributors. A complete list of funders is available at barrykibrick.com.
Laurence, this may not be the reunion of the Beatles, but it is the reunion of me and you.
That's
and
right,
I
yeah.
cannot tell you how grateful I am that you are here with me today.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. We go back, I want to tell the folks, we had a show that we did, It's Fritz on NBC Late Night. You were the musical director with Phil Chen, the bass player, and Bruce Gary.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit, just bring me back to that moment.
Well, actually, that all came about because my wife Hope was doing her band, The Housewives, and somehow they got onto
The original,
the
she got it on the
Fritz
original show, right.
And then it kind of evolved. You asked me to do the series, and I had been gigging a lot with Bruce and Phil because Phil was the bass player from Rod Stewart's band, and now he plays with Robbie Krieger and The Doors.
Oh, by the way, who you had, it's very funny, we had Robbie Krieger on the show, in fact, when he was there.
And then Bruce Gary, the late Bruce Gary, was the drummer with the Knack, and he and I were like jamming buddies. And so it's like, well, there's great rhythm section, let's, and then we'd have all the guests come on, John Mayall and Booker T and Edgar Winter, and
Oh, it was amazing.
the funny one was Sam Kinison.
That's right. Do
Sam
you remember?
and everybody was like really nervous about Sam Kinison, and he walks onto the set, he comes straight over to me and gives me a bear hug. And I thought I'd never met the guy, and it turned out that when I was in New York in the early 80s, and I used to hang out and play at Catch a Rising Star, the comedy club, that he was in the audience, and I inspired him to play guitar.
I
had
can't
no
believe
idea.
that story, because do you know, from that episode, Sam and I became good friends.
Oh, isn't that
and
interesting?
Sam, people, if they don't remember Sam Kinison, some of them,
Great
he was
comedian,
a
yeah.
great comedian, but
wild
more so
man.
a wild man, but a friend. He did a show for me for free because he knew I was doing a pilot, and he just said, no, we're friends already now.
Cool.
He was that kind of a guy. And talk about friends, Phil Chen as well. Phil Chen is just one of the most, his soul as a bass player, his heart is as deep as his bass.
Yeah, if you can understand what he says. Because his kind of like Asian and Jamaican, and there's a patois in there but Phil's cool. I mean, he and I would do studio work together in London in the mid-'70s. Before I joined Wings, I was a studio musician in London.
Oh, let's,
And
now
so
wait a
that
minute.
was part of that scene.
We can't let that go. You didn't join Wings. You're the lead guitar player. You're sitting
yeah.
there with Paul McCartney and Wings. That experience in itself, just a taste of it, because it's just an interesting. I mean, how many people play with the Beatles?
Well, yeah,
or
I mean,
Beatle. You played with all of them except John. You said.
Yeah, I played with 3 out of 4. I mean, it was. I refer to it as like getting my master's from McCartney University, because I learned a lot about aspects of the music business that I'd never learned about, because my goal was always to be a studio musician. I wanted to be a session guitar player. And when I went to college, I studied music and musicology, but I never really studied the business side of it or the production side of it. So as a studio player, I was always behind a music stand, kind of in the room, as opposed to being in the control room and watching the engineering side of it and all of the technical end of it. And then because I was playing on people's records and not writing, I never really learned where the money was. You know, I was just happy to get my session fee, and and if it was double scale, even better. But it wasn't until I worked with Paul that I learned about the real nuts and bolts, the business behind the scenes, and music publishing. And he's become, he's always been a very successful publisher of other people's music. He doesn't always control the rights to his own stuff out of the Beatle catalog, but he has a massive, massive publishing catalog. And so learning about that stuff and then just being on stage with the Beatles was pretty remarkable. And Linda was an incredible person too. I mean, I give her a lot of credit for hanging in there with 4 kids and a full-time job playing keyboards in the band.
You're like Paul as well, because we have this image of musicians. You're also a deep family man with a great wife, beautiful girls, and we don't usually have that image always in our minds of the musician.
Well, Paul and Linda were such a couple, and that was really another dimension to the experience, was just having this great example of a couple working together and having a successful marriage. Of course, it helps to have gazillions of dollars in the bank, but just the fact that they worked so well and there was such a creative bond between them. And that really kind of like flowed into my own marriage. And the Hope and I work together, and she produces a lot of my records, and we write for the stage together, and I've produced stuff of hers. And just having that kind of couple consciousness has been really important to us.
I know it because, as you just met my wife is at every taping. She's the voice people hear on the voiceover, and my son's my director and editor. So there's still something about an old family business that you can't really beat,
right,
am I right?
But beyond the family business, just the idea that you think as a couple, you don't think individually. It's like, what's good for the family, what's good for us.
Yeah. I'll never forget, and this is how I even got the name of the show. I was driving on a train to Munich, and I met a musician who was a classical pianist. And I asked him this question. I said, well, classical pianist, that means that you're playing the same music that anyone else plays. Why aren't you, a Rubinstein or a Horowitz, or what makes the difference? And he says, it's what's between the notes. And whenever I hear you play, that's what I'm always listening for, those things between your notes, because you express it with so much soul.
Thank you. I kind of describe myself musically as being vertical as opposed to horizontal. That whatever's happening in that particular musical moment, in that particular musical space, is what's important to me. So yeah, I can, run off a string of notes, which is what I think of as horizontal, but to do on the vertical plane, what's happening in that moment? How does that relate to what's come before, what comes next? What's the emotional content? How can I voice that on the guitar? So rather than playing this, I might play this to give it a different dimension. And then how all those pieces fit together to create something that is musically, creatively, and guitaristically coherent.
Now, you can't leave us there, because you just gave us a taste. I want you to play something off of your brand new album. Tell the audience what it's going to be.
Well, I'm going to play I Can't Give You Anything But Love, Baby, which was written by Jimmy McHugh and Dorothy Fields in, I think, 1931, somewhere like that. So, we're into the Depression at this point. And they were writing for a musical on Broadway, and they got stuck for inspiration. So they went for a walk down Fifth Avenue. And as they pass Tiffany's, they see a young couple looking in the window, and they hear the guy say to his girlfriend, "I can't give you anything but love, baby." And off they ran to the nearest piano to finish the song.
Laurence, the story is wonderful, but it's not going to compare to the sound coming out of those fingers. Take it away, my friend.
I can't give you anything but love, baby.
And this is from your newest album?
This is from my new album, Downtown. Yeah.
Beautiful. Laurence, the music is timeless. You are timeless. I know people get a lot of their music now on streaming, but I hear there's a special thing they can do if they go to your website.
Yeah, if you go to my website, you can click through to my online store, the LJ store, and you can buy CDs. I mean, this is, I think, my 28th album. It's like there's a lot of stuff.
Tell us the website.
LaurenceJuber.com.
Easy enough to
Easy
remember.
Enough. Yeah, LAU. If you do it with the W, it'll still get you there.
Laurence, your strings make my heart strings pop. I mean, it is just, it's just amazing.
Well, you know, it's what's between the strings.
It is what's between the strings. Yeah. It's just so beautiful. I want to talk about that actually, because when I had, and you introduced me to Robbie Krieger because he was on our show, and as you said, you played with the Three Living Beatles. Right. I've had the Three Living Doors on my show. Yeah. I had Robbie on one show, and then I've had John Densmore and Ray Manzarek. Right. And the one thing that Ray brought up and that John agreed with, and that I wanted to talk to you about, is that music literally, because it's played on a frequency, music is it literally is one of the only art forms that penetrate us. Ray said it hits us in the chakras, but that's what I also, when my family when we're listening to your music, you hit us in our chakras. Is it something you think of when you're playing, that, you know, you're creating these vibrations?
Well, a lot of it's subconscious, I think. I mean, music is vibrational. You know, I mean, the fact that you can have a fundamental note, you can have harmonics of that note that are contained within that note. So even though the notes themselves may seem quite simple, there's a lot of complexity, a lot of interaction between all those harmonic frequencies that comes into play. And for me, it's sonority, it's finding that tone, especially on acoustic guitar, finding the tone that expresses the emotional content. And so I don't think specifically in terms of, okay, I'm going to hit this particular chakra or whatever, but I do think that there has to be within the compass of the music, there has to be the kind of the pelvic element, the gut aspect of it, the heart, the different chakras and how the music might hit in different ways. Because the groove isn't necessarily going to hit you on an intellectual level, but it is certainly going to hit you on a pelvic level.
Oh, and deeper than that. In fact, when you were with my wife and son in the green room, and we said, gosh, we love when you play this Beatles song. And you said, which one? And we said, oh, come on, we know which one, we know which one. And we couldn't think of the name, and you kept naming names, and it didn't come out. And then my wife came running out, and she goes,
Blackbird.
Blackbird, that's the one. And tell us a little bit about that, and then play us your version of Blackbird.
There's an interesting background to that song, because Paul McCartney's accompaniment to it, all this moving two-part texture was inspired, and he admits this in concert. He'll introduce Blackbird and say that he and George learned a Bach bourrée from a lute suite. They'd learned it, but not quite right. This particular piece. And they would play this like as part of their kind of repertoire, like fragments of it. And I always wondered how they learned it, because George never studied classical guitar, neither did Paul, but George was a huge Chet Atkins fan. And then I discovered that tune was on a Chet Atkins record released in 1957 called Hi-Fi in Focus. And I called up Mark Lewison, who is the Beatle expert, bar none. He knows everything there is to know about Beatles. And I said, do we know if George had this record? He said, as a matter of fact, we do. Because one of the fans from the Cavern Club, and they would give themselves these fancy fan names, and this was Susie Cement Mixer. Don't ask me why.
Very fancy.
knocked on George's mum's door in 1963 and asked to do an inventory of George's record collection. And that album was in there. So that's kind of the missing link between Bach and Beatles is Chet Atkins. But the thing about, like, in my process, take a song like Blackbird, it's Blackbird singing in the dead of night, that there's an accompaniment and then there's a vocal. Well, in that particular configuration, there's no easy way to play the accompaniment and the vocal at the same time. So what I do, I retune the guitar, looking down at my tuner over here, to a tuning we call DADGAD, D-A-D-G-A-D, as opposed to standard guitar tuning, which is EBD, GBE. And in using this tuning, what it allows me to do is to incorporate the elements of both the melody and the accompaniment at the same time. And I use this tuning for a lot of stuff because it's a really versatile and useful tuning, and it has its own kind of resonance to it. It sits in a different musical space to standard tuning.
Well then,
so
while it
and
sits
that was how I did my arrangement of Blackbird, which I will now play for you.
Thank you, because I was just going to say, while it sits in that little space, I want to hear it. Thank you, Laurence.
You're
Take
welcome.
it away.
You bet.
It gets me every time, Laurence, when we hear it on the radio, when we hear it here. Oh, what can I tell you?
Thank you.
There is such beauty that comes from those fingers. It is just unbelievable.
They're just regular fingers.
Oh, no, they're not. Those are not regular
They're well
fingers.
trained, with a little bit of super glue on the fingertips when necessary.
I always, by the way, this is the funniest thing. The guitar is something that I actually know 3 chords on, but this is important as a message to people. There's something soothing about even when you hold an instrument, even if you're only playing 3 chords, there's something that soothes the individual. And I can't imagine if it soothes me like that. You use the term woodshed sometimes when you were talking about how you, when you're in that woodshed, are you soothing yourself?
Well, it's kind of like a meditation. That it's just, you get into a zone where time disappears because I'm busy. You know, it can be soothing. It can be soothing. There's certain sonorities that I find soothing to play, but for me, it's like a meditation. I mean, it's just kind of just going into this musical space, and whether it's working on something that is a work in progress or discovering something fresh, it takes me to a different space. And what I try and do is then incorporate that into the performance, so when I'm playing for an audience, it can take them to that space too. So it becomes a shared experience. So it's not, for me, it's not just fingers on strings and notes. It's the kind of the musical and spiritual essence of it. It's just to try and really elevate the experience. But you talk about, learning 3 chords. I mean, the guitar, you go back in the history of the guitar, and I cover this in my book, The Evolution of Fingerstyle Guitar. I go back to the Renaissance with Renaissance lute music and the Spanish vihuela, and then the Renaissance guitar and the Baroque guitar, and how much those 3 chords have been around for hundreds of years.
You know, Laurence, I know that I have more time in my show, and I have more things to talk about.
Well, let's talk about them real quick.
No, I'll tell you why. I'll rather tell them when I'm going to put this on a podcast, and I'll tell them then what I'm thinking now, because you know why? I want to hear more of your music, and I want you now to literally just play as long as you want and take us right out through the credits. I'm not even, goodbye everyone, I'm saying nothing more than this. I'm just letting Laurence play away and just enjoy.
This is a tune of mine called Cobalt Blue.
Become part of the Between the Lines family, go to barrykibrick.com. There you can join our book club, participate in Q&As, catch past episodes, listen to Barry's podcasts, read his blog, and experience exclusive online features, all at barrykibrick.com. Between the Lines with Barry Kibrick is made possible in part by Patreon. Patreon helps creators build and run membership businesses, from podcasters to writers, musicians, artists, and more, with tools that allow their fans to become patrons. More information is available at patreon.com. And Between the Lines with Barry Kibrick Access is available at barrykibrick.com.